Welcome to Unit 21 in the Laboratory Manual for Anatomy and Physiology students. This chapter appears also as Unit 20 in the prior editions of the manual. For this topic, we're going to discuss the lymphatic system and a little bit introduction to the immunology or immune system of the body. Keep in mind that the lymphatic system is a system of blood vessel-like structures, the lymphatic ducts, that carry immune cells, excess proteins and other waste material, other components throughout the body through these green, usually in color, blood vessel-like ducts. They appear in green, not in the body, but in images in anatomy textbooks, just to kind of differentiate them from nerves, which are usually shown as yellow, and red and blue blood vessels, arteries and veins. So again, when you see what looks like blood vessels but in green color next to arteries and veins in the body in the illustrations, most likely you're looking at the lymphatic system. Now, there are three main functions of the lymphatic system that we can talk about here. Primarily, the best way to think about is the lymph fluid, which is a transparent or grayish to transparent liquid that travels through the lymphatic ducts. Usually, basically, it's transporting excess interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid is that liquid that is found throughout the body in different tissues between the cells, right? This is a type of extracellular fluid. So not a liquid found in the blood or inside the cytoplasm of cells, but found in the peripheral tissues, some of the liquid escaping from the blood or from the cells and finds its way between the cells and the tissues and has nowhere to go. So that liquid, in order not to cause edema or swelling, not to cause excess accumulation of that fluid, it has to be picked up, right? So it becomes this interstitial fluid that is carried over into the lymph, and the lymph then transports it throughout the body to move it away from those localized areas. Eventually, lymph actually gets joined into the venous system, and the heart, as the main pump, then kind of accepts that fluid into the blood and then allows the circulation to continue. So that's one function. The second function is activation of the immune system. Now, our immune system does not have an on-off switch, but at certain points, more aspects of the immune system, more of the different cells, white blood cells, other components need to be kind of alerted to the problem, to the infection that's taking place in the body. And the lymphatics plays a big role in that, together with the lymph nodes, which are often enlarged during infections. And as we talk about further and further here, it's part of the immune response and targeted effect for the inflammation. So when the body is trying to find the invaders, find the microbes that are causing inflammation, lymphatics plays a big role in doing that and helping the immune system do its job. And the last function that's kind of unrelated to this is the fact that lymphatics inside the gastrointestinal tract, in the digestive system, especially the small intestine, plays a great role in accepting dietary fat. So dietary fat is very hard to break down because fat molecules, lipid molecules, are not soluble in blood and cannot be simply entering into the capillaries. So we have these called lacteals, which are like lymphatic capillaries inside the wall of the digestive system that actually absorb the fat molecules first, and then after a period of time, after they're processed further, can finally enter the bloodstream eventually. So again, when you're eating something that has fat in it, absorption of dietary fat occurs thanks to the lacteals, which is part of the lymphatic system. Now, what is the actual structure of the lymphatic system? Again, when you see the illustration in this chapter, you're going to see a person with these green-like blood vessel-like structures, or not green-like, I'm sorry, green blood vessel-like structures, these lymphatic ducts that we call them, and that's the main component of the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system should be noted that it's found pretty much everywhere in the body except for the central nervous, except for the brain, because there we have the circulation of the CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid, and that plays a kind of similar role to the lymphatics, and so there are no specific lymphatic vessels within that area, but otherwise pretty much everywhere else in the body we do have lymphatic vessels there and the lymph nodes. Now, every few inches, the lymphatic duct enlarges and becomes a lymph node. You can see the structure of lymph node in the book, and you'll see basically there's these channels going into this area where lymphocytes and other types of cells like T cells and B cells are actually awaiting instructions and doing the job of surveillance, trying to monitor the blood, trying to monitor the lymphatic fluid, seeing whether any kind of microbes, bacteria, viruses, or other enemies are entering the body. And then in the case of inflammation, in the case of actual presence of infection, the lymph nodes will become often enlarged as more and more fluid and more white blood cells enter it, and basically starting to activate the immune system and help the body to fight infection. The lymph nodes in the body, again, you don't need to know the names of specific lymph nodes, but essentially they are named according to the localized area. So those in the neck are cervical lymph nodes, those in the armpit are axial lymph nodes, and so on and on, right? Again, you can see for specific locations, certain lymph nodes aggregate and in specific areas and have more kind of recognized names and a little bit more clinically important, and others less so. But essentially, again, they're named according to the anatomical locations. Now, there's also much larger organs. The good thing is about the lymphatics that histologically, when you see either a lymph node or any of these other structures, part of the lymphoid organs, they all look very, very similar under a microscope, which means if you're not sure whether this is part of lymphatics and you go through all of these, as long as you recognize the general structure of a lymph node, you will see that many of the others, there's the typical structure histologically of lots of these blue cells, right? Large nucleus, high nuclear to cytoplasmic ratio. These cells, these kind of pools of cells, often lets you know that you are in some kind of lymphoid tissue. So the largest of the structures here is the spleen. The spleen, remember, is the organ that's located under the diaphragm on the left side in the abdominal cavity. This is the organ that has red and white pulp. Histologically, essentially, you're thinking of an organ that, again, number one, plays a role as part of the lymphatics, as part of surveillance, part of helping the immune system, and has another very important job is that after those 120 days have spent, the mature erythrocytes or red blood cells that are done doing their work, they actually, at the end of their life, go to the spleen, where the spleen finally sort of recycles them, so removes the hemoglobin, starts the process of hemoglobin metabolism, and gets rid of the rest of the kind of shell of the red blood cell. So, two functions at the very least for the spleen. One is that the spleen plays a role in the immune system, helping the immune function, helping the body fight infections. And second one deals with the recycling of the red blood cells. For people who have no spleen, who have undergone splenectomy, or are functionally asplenic, because maybe their spleen is present but is not working, or have been born without a spleen, so they are asplenic congenitally from birth, for those patients, they need to be particularly kind of vigilant and careful. They need extra vaccinations, because certain types of infections, particularly those of certain bacterial infections, they're encapsulated bacterial infections like pneumococcal types, are more common and more dangerous in these patients without the spleen, and so we kind of need to be on alert for that and kind of have special protocols for these patients in clinical medicine. Some of the other structures here, we have Peyer's patches. Again, these are essentially lymphoid structures in the deeper walls of the small intestines. They again are there to alert the immune system. They're kind of picking up on what kind of antigens are flowing through the digestive tract as you're eating that food and it's trying to get broken down and absorbed. So again, each of these areas will be specific to a certain area, right? Specific location. So again, Peyer's patches, thinking of digestive tract, inner wall of the small intestine. We have tonsils, again, very similar now. These are located in the head and neck and kind of deeper oral cavity areas, right? Also called adenoids sometimes. These are kind of, can be thought of sort of externalized lymph nodes. Very similar, again, they're there to kind of pick up on the antigens that are entering as you're breathing in air and eating in the food, right? Swallowing the food, and so entering through the oral cavity. Tonsils are there to kind of pick up on those antigens, to identify them, to alert perhaps the immune system if anything dangerous has been swallowed or ingested, like that. And the last one here is the thymus. This is somewhat different. This is a structure that is considered part of the lymphatics and actually the endocrine system to some extent. This is a structure where the reason we talk about here in the lymphatics is because the thymus, if you think back to the T cells, like when we talked about in the discussion of white blood cells, T cells, B cells, other lymphocytes, right? That letter T there actually is because T from the thymus. So when regular T cells or any kind of T cell is first born in the bone marrow, that cell actually does not yet know how to recognize antigens. It needs to learn how to do that, it needs to learn how to recognize friend from foe, how to tell the difference between dangerous cells that might be entering the body or normal regular cells as part of the host. T cells need to go to the thymus first, where they get educated about the different antigens in the body, and once that thymus determines that the T cells have learned to recognize friend from foe and be able to properly make that distinction without attacking normal cells of the body, then the thymus lets them go and allows them to be released into the bloodstream. Those cells that have been deemed by thymus not to be successful in that recognition processes, the thymus destroys those cells and so does not allow them to enter the bloodstream under normal circumstances. The interesting thing about the thymus is, again, is because our immune system early on in life is just developing. The thymus is really large in a child. Again, the thymus is located under the sternum, over the heart area, in the chest. And then as we get older and older, the thymus kind of involutes and basically shrinks because the immune system by that time has matured and has already gained all the proper knowledge for this purpose. Now, the second part of this lecture in the chapter is introduction to the immune system. Immune system immunology is a very large topic, but we can talk about some of the basics here very briefly. So, when you're thinking about the immune system, you're thinking about there are different cells in the blood and in the body that help you fight infections. So regular cells like leukocytes, white blood cells, such as neutrophils that do phagocytosis and have all kinds of granules that they can release to fight against microbes. Macrophages that do, again, phagocytosis, large cells found as monocytes, and other macrophages that, again, can swallow non-discriminately anything from bacteria to viruses to even particles of like sand or anything, pretty much inanimate objects, or let's say something from an implant that a person might have. And other cells like lymphocytes like we just mentioned. There's also other cells that we didn't talk about yet before, such as mast cells. These are often do not travel in the blood, but are located within the skin, for instance, very commonly. These cells are very unique because they actually are able to release, as they degranulate, they release a vasoactive amine called histamine. Vasoactive means it acts on blood vessels, right? As soon as histamine is released, basically causes blood vessels in that area to very quickly dilate, bringing more blood to that area, more cells, and account for the cardinal signs on pathology in terms of what happens to you when you have an infection in a localized area. Right? That area becomes red, swollen, painful. Okay, so there's redness because there's more blood there. It becomes swollen because there's more blood going to that area. It becomes painful because nerve endings are irritated by histamine and other molecules that travel there. Now, you might not see mast cells in histology because they're often hard to see unless they're really kind of identified with immunohistochemistry or something like that. But again, you might just something to kind of remember and place them along with other cells as part of immune defenses. Now, what are specific ways that the immune system uses to fight against infections, right? So the immune system does not rely on any one method. It uses a combination of methods depending on the severity of the inflammation, depending on how widespread the problem is. So what I just mentioned about those cardinal signs in pathology, these are signs of inflammation, right? So if globally, or basically for the entire body, what we see as like warmth in one area, right? Because more and more blood is going there. We see that, right? We can transfer this as fever. Think of it as fever, right? What is fever? Fever basically is when the body temperature is elevated due to the hypothalamic controls, and that slight change by a few degrees of temperature in the body hopefully, right, causes microbes to die, right? Those that have entered our body that are our enemies. And so it's sort of like you're cooking something in the oven, you raise the temperature, and it cooks basically those microbes. Right? So fever is very important. It's one of the first signs of an infection. And this is our way of body of saying, yes, the immune system is functioning, it's robust, it's providing a appropriate response to the inflammation. And so overall, as we're saying, this is our immune response of the body. Okay, again, in localized areas, this could simply mean dilation of blood vessels. More blood goes to the area, more white blood cells go there, so they can fight the infection. Now, overall, right, the summary of the forms of defense here for the body, we have either cells fight infection, we call this cell-mediated immunity. Either antibodies are used to fight infection, we call this humoral immunity. Keep in mind, antibodies are those generated by the plasma cells, which talk to B cells and T cells to learn what kind of antibodies need to be created against a very specific antigen, and then generate those antibodies like immunoglobulin G, IgG, IgA, Ig, and others in order to fight those microbes. And then one other form, which is the complement system, and this might not be mentioned in our book, not in the lab manual at least, but you will see this is a very important aspect of the immune defenses, is that sometimes there is actually a collection of soluble proteins in the blood, which we call C3A, C5, basically from C1 to C9. These soluble proteins recognize those cells that have been infected by something or problematic for whatever reason, and actually they line up on the surface of the cell and make a hole and basically destroy the cell by letting the cell contents to leak out. We call this MAC, or membrane attack complex. Again, MAC is a collection of complement proteins lining up on the cell surface of the cell and destroying the cell like that by essentially making a hole through that double membrane of phospholipids and letting the contents leak out. Again, obviously this is a very major, very dramatic event. Only happens to cells that actually have been targeted for destruction because they've been either infected by a virus or maybe are tumor cells or have some kind of other very serious problem. It's kind of hard to deal with through other methods, but yet we have yet another way to fight against these problems, okay, as part of the immune response. Again, make sure you are reading this chapter and looking at all the illustrations specifically for all the different organs, like the spleen, tonsils, thymus, and the lymphatics that we talked about, and seeing what they look like in the body.